Hello, this is Eric Lange here, Chair of the NSPKU. Just giving a personal tribute to Dr. John Noble Nesbitt. There are many superlatives that could be used to describe John and his time with the NSPKU and in PKU in general. We all know he was a true volunteer and devoted many hours of his own time and energy to the NSPKU. In many ways, he was a role model of commitment. It must be noted that John was engaged with metabolic professionals and dietitians to push for the medical advisory panel and to draw into the PKU community these professionals to get a greater so they could get a greater understanding of PKU and the issues associated with it, because it's not just diet. We all know that it goes beyond that. He called for Diet for Life, which in many respects in those days was way, way, way ahead of his time. Many of the people in the PKU community will certainly wholeheartedly agree with him now, and certainly the European guidelines have called for that. It is Diet for Life. I do recall John, certainly in the meetings, the AGMs that I've chaired, John always made a comment. It was always a constructive comment, whether it would be on the accounts, what the NSPK should be doing for the future, how we're progressing as a society. And even before I was on the Council of Management, all those years ago, he was always present and made his comments constructively felt by everybody in the community. So we all remember, many people who've been around for many, many years will remember his comments at the AGM. An AGM wasn't complete without John's presence. John was a very approachable man and gave advice freely without imposing himself on anybody. It didn't matter who you were, where you came from, what level of PKU your child or you as an individual had. He was a marvellous chap and he will be sorely missed. There are some big boots to fill. So it's my heartfelt thanks to John for all his work he did in the past. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Richard Noble Nesbitt, and I'm joined by my mother, Brenda Noble Nesbitt, who we thought would give a little bit of an account to and fro between myself, PKU of 49 years old, been on the diet all my life, and my mother, who was very much involved with my father, who passed away, unfortunately, in October last year. And we wanted to give an account of the early days of PKU and what my father did for PKU and the experiences that my mother and my father had at that time. So thought what I'll do is run it as a little bit of a Q&A session so that Mum can give some of her views on what happened, some of her memories. So Mum, I know that obviously this is new to you, doing the Zoom approach, so thank you very much for giving the time now, and I know you're now very comfortable with Zoom, having done one before as a preparation. So firstly, I just wanted to focus on how you and Dad specifically approached the diagnosis for both Duncan and obviously separately myself, which would be a very different experience. And then, you know, what that first contact was like, and then how you decided to get more involved with the NSPKU.
Should I start at the beginning? And Duncan was born in 1967. In those days, there was a nappy test to test for PKU, and he had a nappy test at 3 weeks, which was negative, which we didn't take any notice of. We didn't know really what it was about. Then the health visitor came to the house when he was 6 weeks old and did another nappy test. And the fence stick turned green, and the health visitor said, "Oh, I've never had one of these before. I've been testing for 5 years, never seen a post. I'll just go into my car and see what it's about." And she came back with a new bottle of Fenisticks. Maybe this won't do. Oh, this turned green as well. I'll go into my car and see what's happening. And my dad was home for lunch, about to go back, actually. He was always home for lunch for about 20 minutes, half an hour. And he went into his study to see his textbooks. He's a physiologist, so he knew. He had heard of PKU, but didn't know anything about it, really. The health visitor went into her car and read up, and they both came to the conclusion at the same time it was phenylketonuria. So the health visitor came back into the house and said what it was, and we've got to get the baby to the hospital. She phoned up the hospital and was offered an appointment next week. And she said, no, not next week, now, today. And meanwhile, we were thinking, what on earth's going on? This sounds serious. Anyway, we took Duncan to the hospital that afternoon, and the consultant wanted to keep him in because he only had one other patient with PKU who was very damaged because he'd not been diagnosed. And the consultant didn't really know all that much about it. So we said, should we take Duncan to Great Ormond Street? Oh, you take him if you want, and I'll not have anything more to do with him. No, we said, would it help? And he said, well, we'll see. We'll keep him in. And I said, no, we'll not keep him in. I'll deal with it. Oh, you can't possibly deal with this. It's far too complicated. And we said, well, we're both scientists. We're experimental scientists. We know what we're doing. So he gave us the information. We came home with Duncan with lists and lists of things, and an absolutely awful, but in months to come, we found it wasn't as awful as all that, supplement to feed him on called Minifen. And for 6 months, he was fine on that. And then it was changed because he was getting older to Simagran, which was absolutely revolting. People who think the supplements now are awful should try Simagran. It just beggars belief as to how horrible it is. And Duncan went on Simagran and started being sick every feed. It would take me, because he hated it, about an hour to get it into him. Then it would come back all over everything, so I'd have to wash everything and start again. He was 8 pounds born, 16 pounds at 6 months old, and 15 pounds at a year old, because the Simagran was not doing him any good. We had 3 awful years like that. And then we were on holiday when he was 3. And when we arrived home, there was a letter on the doorstep saying there was an experimental thing called PK-8, which would you like to be an experimental part of? And we said yes. And we never looked back from that. It was a joy to feed him then. He was never sick at all. In fact, I don't think he's ever sick in his life now. And he put on weight and he did everything that he was supposed to do. And so that went on until 5 years later, we had Richard, who was actually born.
Me?
Yes, who was actually born on the exact 5th year anniversary of Duncan being diagnosed, the 5th of June. And he went on the Minifen and did quite well. It was very sad, really, because I wanted to try experimentally to feed him myself, but they wouldn't let me. They said it couldn't be done. Years later, they found that it could be done, but that's another story. Breastfed for the... Well, you had a blood test because it had changed from the nappy test at 10 days old, which was positive. So they then started feeding you this substitute. And at 6 months old, they said Simagran. And I opened the tin and I was sick. And I said, there's no way he's going on Simagran after what it did to Duncan. I'll put him straight onto the Aminogran, which it was then called by then. And they said, can't possibly do that. He's too young to go on that. I said, that's what he's doing. And he did. And he did very well on it. And things progressed over the years.
So that was PK-8 actually turned into Aminogran. That was the old...
No, it was not PK-8. PK-8 it was called.
PK-8, sorry.
It just had a number.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I was just going to say the background of Dad being a scientist you mentioned there before. So was that one of the reasons why I remember one of the stories around when we were younger that Dad used to take a black book around everywhere and measure, especially when Duncan was diagnosed in those 3 critical years, that he was measuring everything that was coming up and everything that was going down for Duncan.
Yes, in the it was difficult to measure what was coming up, but I got quite adept at catching it. But in those days, everything had to be measured. Duncan was on a very low phenylalanine diet. He just had 150 milligrams altogether for the whole day, and straight, well, it was actually 140, and if I went up to 150, his blood level would rise.
Yeah, and those were in the days where it was pre-exchanges, so even though that's almost equivalent to 3 exchanges now, in new money, as we call it, in those days we were counting everything from apples to tomatoes to oranges. And I always remember oranges were 30 milligrams, kind of apples were 10 milligrams, and we used to kind of do that. So 140 milligrams, you could have 14 apples a day, and that's it. But that's just the system, wasn't it?
And one egg was 450 milligrams.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I remember that as well. Okay, well, that's really good. That gives a little bit of background. I think what I wanted to do is focus a little bit on Dad's involvement with NSPKU, where that started from, where that sprung, because I understand that obviously we were in America, because I was about a year old, wasn't I? This is fast forwarding to 1973.
Yes, and we were in
America. Yeah,
we were in America till Christmas, and then Dad was coming home for lunch, and the letterbox went, and I went to see what it was. And it was a letter from the dietitian at the hospital saying that there was this group formed to deal with PKU. And I just sat down on the doorstep there and then and read all of it. And the Dad's lunch was a bit late that day. And there was in that information, there was talk of a meeting in Huddersfield on the Sunday. Now, at that time, we had a very small car, because we'd sold our bigger one to go to America. And so we hired the car, put all 6 of us in the car, and went to Huddersfield to join this meeting. And we got a very good reception. We thought this is something worthwhile, and that's the way it went.
So how did you find out about that meeting initially? So how was that? Because
it was in the information that the dietitian sent us about the formation of the society.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know if it was actually called NSPKU at that time.
No, it was called something else.
Well, just a group of people with PKU children.
So that was 73. And when was the first conference then?
They'd already had the first conference before we found out about it. I can't remember the exact dates we found out, but we went to a conference in Blackpool, well, St Anne's on Sea, actually. The second conference it was, and the conferences at those days used to be always the first weekend in March. And we went, and Duncan was 7, and it was the first time I'd ever seen another PKU apart from you.
Wow, so that was at least 6-7 years later, right?
Yes, he was 7. And I'd always, even though they'd always said he would be all right, I'd never really accepted that he would be until I saw all these other children who were obviously all right, and he was all right, and you were all right. So it was the beginning of a new life, really.
Yeah, but living in Norwich, obviously there weren't that many PKUs in Norwich. It's always out and a bit in a limb even now. So then there was no way of easily being able to find any other PKUs for the first 6-7 years.
It's all to do with the immigration patterns over the centuries, and people from affected countries didn't come to Norwich. In fact, not many people came to Norfolk at all. It was very isolated. Whereas where we're from, the northeast, there were lots of immigrants from Scandinavia and from Ireland. And it's believed that the gene first went from Scandinavia to Ireland and then came back to England.
Yeah, and that's where the mutations come from, obviously. Just focusing again on the conference. So, your first conference, do you have any memories of that? Like what that was like for the first time, seeing all those new PKU faces and meeting other families with PKUs?
It was just marvellous, really, because we'd had quite a hard time of it, as perhaps you can imagine. And always, as I said, at the back of my mind, it wasn't going to work. But in fact, it has, since you both have degrees now and are all right.
Well, I think we've done okay.
Yeah, I think you've done okay.
So did you have any barriers then just to set things up? Because obviously in those days it was very much different kind of thought process in terms of the NHS in the 70s. And
the medical people were very against this meeting because they didn't want the PKU children to meet and then perhaps subsequently go on to marry. And we always said, well, why not? It's keeping it in the family. And they didn't think we knew enough to set up a medical advisory panel, which we then managed to because of your dad's qualifications. And it grew and thrived. I remember being on the NSPKU committee and being so amazed and thrilled and pleased that we'd managed to accumulate £1,000 in the bank balance with dint of hard work, everybody fundraising like mad, selling Christmas cards. Yeah.
So then fast forward a little bit and say what kind of work Dad obviously did and obviously you working in partnership with Dad in those kind of early years of the NSPKU and the conferences. Because I remember I always have memories of being very small, being one of the screeching children around the conferences at every single conference. But obviously you'll have different memories, so you're good to get some of those.
It was a joy in many ways because learning more about the condition, but also mixing with other people. And they organised a creche for the children. Well, we live in Norwich, but we're not from Norwich, and we didn't have any relations around to help me with the children. So I had the children 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no relief. But going to the conference, they went into the creche. So there I was a person again. And interesting lectures and cookery demonstrations.
And how was Dad involved with all that?
Well, after that first meeting, we went to every meeting, which then became called the Council of Management. Brian Smith was the first chairman, and your dad became vice chairman. And then I can't remember when it was, he became chairman. And I think for about 7 or 8 years he was chairman, and then he helped set up the medical advisory panel and became chairman of that, and that worked quite well. He made contacts with a man called Richard Ward, who was a tailor by profession, but his son was a celiac, and they found there was no special food available for celiacs, so he set about making it. He had a factory, and once he got his son sorted out, he looked around to see if there was anything else allied to that, and got on to NSPKU. And we found, even though not all were suitable for both, there were lots of things suitable for the celiacs that would do for the PKUs as well. So we set up, and it was lovely getting extra things because up to that point there were no special foods available at all. It was a case of tinned bread, which was not very nice, what they called flour, which was more like corn flour. And I'm a good cook, but it was more or less impossible to make anything with this. There were no protein rusks, and that was it. That was literally it. So to get the first thing we got from Richard Ward, may not have been the first thing, we got some chocolate chip cookies. When Duncan was first diagnosed, they were saying that the diet would be finished when they were 7. And he, as a physiologist, said, what nonsense, because the human body continues renewing its cells all its life. It's not 7 years, it's life. And in the early days, he had quite a fight about that. But by the time Duncan got to 7, they weren't saying 7 anymore, they were saying 12. And when he got to 12, they weren't saying 12 anymore, they were saying later. And then now it seems to be that they accept your dad's wisdom from the beginning. Well, we worked together all along. I worked with him at his job as well. So we were a partnership always. But I wanted to say something else about children, because it was said that we shouldn't have any more children because there'd be a 1 in 4 chance of having another one the same. And we didn't think that mattered really. But when you were born, the pent-up anxiety for 5 years came out. I don't understand why I said it now, but I said to Duncan, we've got some bad news for you. The baby's got PKU as well. And his little face lit up and he came across and hugged you and said, oh, somebody to share my diet. And you've been as close as can be ever since. Yeah. So for anybody who thinks that they shouldn't risk another PKU, it's the best thing we could have done for both of you.
Hello to you all. I'm Duncan Noble Nesbitt and I'm son of John Noble Nesbitt. Now I've been asked to say a few words today and just to give a bit of an outline of my father, both in terms of my father, but also in terms of NSPKU and the amazing amount of work that he's done over the years prior to his passing on the 20th of October 2020. My father, John Noble Nesbitt, was born on the 25th of August 1934 in Gateshead, and part of a large family. He was one of 7. Grew up in Gateshead, going to Gateshead Grammar School, and was actually the first in his family to go to university. And not only did he go to university, he went to Cambridge, at which he got a double first in zoology and biology. And his studies continued and carried on to a PhD at Cambridge. It was around about this time that he met my mum in the holidays back from Cambridge. They met at a dance and so started their lifelong romance. As the studies developed, Mum and Dad got closer and got married in 1959, and around about the same sort of time Dad was finishing his studies and took up posts, first of all in Canada, believe it or not. He went over to Canada, so his first post, and stayed and lived out there for I think it was a year or 2 that they stayed out there, but then came back to the UK and settled in Norwich, which is in fact where I was born. My dad joined the UEA, which was then just a new university, was just starting to develop its faculties, and my dad joined the biology faculty there. He carried on with his lecturing studies and so on, and had my brother Martin, who's my oldest brother and obviously firstborn. And then in 1967, 25th of April, I came along. One thing that I have known about is that my dad was very involved with the PKU diet right from the word go. In fact, from the first few months of life, bearing in mind 6 weeks took us to the 5th of June, that's my diagnosis day. Within a couple of days, my mum and dad were going through all the information as it was then in 1967, and my dad filled out a little book which contained basically all my information over several, right the way through for the first few months. This is the first book, and apparently there's records going back for going on forwards for that for a while longer. But this little book, I'll just read out my diagnosis. Blood test result was 58, and that's in the old thing, and that works out as 3,400 in what we currently use, not 800, 1,000, 1,200, but 3,400. So I was put straight away on the diet as it was then, age 6 weeks. And this book just details just everything that was, the amount of feed that I had, the total amount of water I had, the ounces of feed early on, the Ketabite tablets that I had, everything written down in great detail, including when I first started on Simagran. It's got the regime written out, and then different regimes for different levels. for different days of the week, and everything all worked out. And this is very much how my father was throughout, not just my early diagnosis of PKU, but all the way through going into the NSPKU as well, which I'll come to. But essentially, my father and mother together both figured really early on that obviously this is a condition that is going to affect the rest of the rest of the lives in terms of a long-term condition, something that would need a lot of effort, and they were very prepared to do that in the early days, and also made a pledge that it wouldn't really stop them from doing things as well. And apparently, in this book here, it outlines that within a couple of weeks of being on a diet, we went off to holiday in the Isle of Wight, and it details in there as well, the week that we were away, everything that had, from the hotel we stayed at, the feed that was having and so on. And that feeling of wanting to not let things hold them back was something that carried on through, because apparently aged 2 or so, we went to live in Portugal. Again, my father had a short sabbatical out in Portugal. We went to live out there as a toddler. I went out there with my older brother. But then I had another brother, Paul, who was 3 years younger than me. He came to this world, tested for PKU also straight away with my history, and he was negative, so he's non-PKU. And then my youngest brother came along in 1972, who was tested with for PKU and positive. So he was PKU, and I remember the diagnosis actually, and Mum and Dad were a bit concerned how to take the news and so on, but apparently took it very well. But this was all early 1970s. The NSPKU hadn't been formed. In fact, we went away in 1973 and lived in the States, where over in the States they had a lot more in terms of products available for PKUs. In the UK, things were very, very basic in terms of there was Prosprol, which was a type of emulsion imitation milk, and a very, very basic starch flour, and some biscuits and very little else. But essentially, when we were in the States, Mum and Dad noticed that the additional products that were available. And when we came back to the UK, the NSPKU had started whilst we were away, and they were told about it when they got back, and my mum and my father particularly was straight onto that and joined the NSPKU in 1974, a few months after it started in 73. And my dad got very, very involved really early on from in the NSPKU, and we're straight onto the committee. Bear in mind, I was 6 coming on to 7, and my little brother Richard was 1 coming on to 2, and my father got, as I say, very involved in the NSPKU, and worked closely with the original committee members, and soon after was lobbying to start a MAP medical advisory panel, which obviously still runs to this day and is an integral part of the NSPKU. So my dad became the chairman of NSPKU after a little while, I think it's about a year or 2, and remained chairman for right the way through into the late 80s. And during his time with NSPKU, we took forward a number of different things that I've just mentioned. For instance, the products that were very, very limited. Made inquiries to potentially have further products brought to the UK that we didn't have at the time, and things like bread mixes, and there was a Jolly Joan pancake mix, remember, from the States that we'd been able to find the suppliers for, and got a distributor over in the UK, and products started increasing through the mid-70s onwards, and gradually built up. Now, during my dad's time as chairman, he was involved in sort of many sides of things, not just the the running of the organisation of NSPKU, but really pushing the boundaries in terms of liaising closely with medical professionals through the medical advisory panel, but also championing the early thoughts about PKU in term, from the point of view of the early thoughts were for people to come off, those with PKU to come off first of all at age 5 or 7, and then 12, and then again at 16. And each of those milestones, my father particularly resisted, not just resisted, but actually in some ways had big robust discussions. I remember one or two of them for my own consultations, about the merits of sticking with what was known to be working. My levels have been consistently low ever since that very high level that I mentioned. Within a couple of weeks, they'd come down into the reference ranges, about 120 to 240 as it was, I think, then, but obviously in the old, so that would be between 2 and 4 or 2 or 5 on the old scale. And my levels have remained tight all the way through, and my father argued that it's best to stay with what we know was working rather than going to the unknown of coming off diets. We didn't come off diet at age 5 or 7, didn't come off at age 12, and encouraged all the way through. Now, obviously, during this time, the NSPKU was was having conferences, annual conferences, and as part of those conferences, we had, like we do currently, we have conference sessions, and there's a lot of conference sessions about, PKU treatment and management going into the future. And I remember sitting in them as a teenager and starting to think myself, yes, influenced by my father, absolutely, but at the same time, coming to my own decisions, and I think guided by my father, have remained on PKU diet all the way through. I'm 54 now, nearly said 53, I'm 54 now, and I've been on the diet ever since that 5th of June 1967 when first diagnosed. Now, my father, as I say, remained on the NSPKU up until the late 80s, and during that period of time, a number of different milestones happened, including during the 80s. There was discussions about, as I mentioned before, staying on treatment, for life, and diet for life became a bit of a mantra towards the late 80s, and obviously continued into the 90s with the MRC recommendations, which came through in 1994. But my father, even though he came off the NSPKU committee and chairmanship and so on, remained very involved in the NSPKU, coming along to annual conferences all the way through the 90s into the 2000s, and was able to help give us wisdom in various things like the NSPKU meetings and the AGMs and so on, and giving his guidance where requested and sometimes not, but also became very involved in talking to parents as a conference goer, and spoke, I'm sure, to many new parents and so on, and along with my mother, giving that support, a little bit more in the background, but always there. I'm hoping that one of his lasting legacies is the fact that he pushed, early on, to push the medical thinking at the time in the 70s and 80s that it was okay to come off diet, and actually, really push that forward to the point where more and more people sort of were discussing that, and ended up in the recommendations that came through in the 90s, and I think it's now considered normal that people remain on treatment, through their PKU life, which was very much not the case in the 70s and 80s. Remember going along to conferences with kids that I played with that no longer came along because they came off diet, and I remember my dad saying at the time, that it's best that we stick with, talking to me and to Richard, saying it's best to stick with what we know, and that's always stuck with me. And that was my decision when I was age 16, when I was given my own decision whether I wanted to come off. And I thought, no, show me it's safe to stay on diet. Show me it's safe to come off diet, and I'll consider it. And of course, they weren't able to do that in the mid 80s, and so I remained on and remained through Adult Clinic. And yes, influenced by my father, I know that, but at the same time, I'm hoping that he's obviously influenced a number of other people, those thoughts, and maybe shaped some of the course of the of the way we think about and treat PKU, from the 70s and 80s onwards. So I've talked rather a lot, and there's other interviews I'm aware of, and they'll be part of today's International PKU Day, and it's a great time to reflect on the wonderful work that my dad did, and for which truly grateful, and personally I feel forever in debt. Thank you very much.